Good evening, folks, and I'm delighted to tell you a little something about our excellent speaker this evening, Carol Berkin. But I'm just going to offer a few highlights because I know you're eager to hear from Carol. Her title is, this is the academic title, she is Presidential Professor of History Emerita at Baruch College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, CUNY, in other words. And I know you'd like to know that Carol was an early proponent of establishing the field of American women's history, which only in, I would say, the most recent two and a half decades has gained full recognition in history departments at our universities. It was not easy, I assure you. And also because she is an expert in women's history, you can imagine that she has written books on that subject. In fact, an astonishing number of them, and primarily focused on women in her era, her specialty, which is women of the 18th and 19th centuries. But she has also written other books. There's one on the American Revolution. She wrote a fine book on the formation of the United States Constitution. And she also has written a book that is focused on the Bill of Rights. I would say that she's probably written a dozen books, which is really quite a remarkable corpus. In addition to this, she is a favorite talking head in many documentaries on public television and also on the History Channel. And maybe some of you have seen her there. And to top it all off, she serves on a number of boards, and I'm only going to mention two important boards. The National Women's History Museum, which is being developed in Washington, D.C., and the New York Historical Society's new Center for American Women's History, which I hope you'll all want to visit. And I happen to know that she also, in addition to all of this, that she ran a household and she raised two fine children. So I would say that Carol herself is a model of women's activism and accomplishment. Finally, she is the ideal person to speak to us tonight because she combines women's history with her studies of the Constitution. And as many of you know, this year is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment when it was implemented, which established women's right, of course, for the first time to vote in our elections, which you just might have noticed recently turns out to be quite important. One more sort of footnote, we're going to have time for questions at the end of Carol's talk, and you are able to ask your question through the chat icon, either during her talk or after the talk. So I hope you know where your chat icon is. I think it's the blue circle on my screen. And so now I am very pleased indeed to present to you Professor Carol Berkin.
So Carol, let me just share my screen and then everyone else should turn their video off and we'll get going. Let's see. Let me get this out of here. Okay, Carol, you're off to the races.
Okay. First, thank you, Pat, for the introduction and for mentioning my two spectacular children who are now grown and have children of their own. And I'm delighted to be here and talk about a subject near and dear to the hearts of all women's historians. What I'm about to say, if you know the standard version of women's long road to suffrage, might surprise you, but I like to do that. In 1881, a trio of women activists published the first of 3 volumes on the history of the women's suffrage movement. Together, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Matilda Gage created the myth of Seneca Falls. Oh, not that the convention at Seneca Falls in 1848 never happened. Of course it did. But their history of women's suffrage declared this gathering to be the origins of the suffrage movement. Indeed, they declared it the origins of the entire movement for American women's equality. Citing the convention's Declaration of Sentiments, with its 18 demands for everything from equal access to education to an end to the laws that deprived married women of most legal rights, to an insistence on the provision of economic opportunities, the authors made their case that the entire agenda for reform, not simply suffrage, was created at Seneca Falls. What motivated their work? Well, they were growing older, and they knew their movement for suffrage was flagging in 1881. Its energies divided between 2 rival organizations, one led by Stanton and Anthony, the other by Lucy Stone and Elizabeth Blackwell. They feared that the younger generation had nothing and soon no one to guide them, nothing to teach them what priorities they should hold dear, and nothing to help them mold a collective identity. The history of women's suffrage gave them all of this. It gave them a shared origin myth, but at a price. In elevating Seneca Falls, these 3 women consigned earlier pioneers in the battle for equality to history's dust heap. It's certainly true that the future prospects of the movement were dim. Women activists believed that their work in abolition and their support of the Union in the Civil War was going to secure for them equality for all. But male abolitionists, believing they were realists, insisted that the federal government must pursue one reform at a time. And the reform most needed and most appealing to the Republican Party in power was voting rights for African-American men. Their motives may have been to protect the former slaves, but their success lay primarily in the Republican certainty that those Black male voters would cast their votes for the party of Lincoln. The 15th Amendment not only gave Black men the vote, it defined full citizenship by gender. It was the first time the modifier male ever appeared in the Constitution. The passage of this amendment prompted Stanton to declare, "Manhood suffrage is woman's destruction." And Anthony challenged Frederick Douglass, the famous former slave and advocate of abolition, challenged his claim that the Black man was more imperiled than women and therefore needed the government's support. "I tell him," Anthony said, "that wronged and outraged as they are by this hateful and mean prejudice against color, he would not today exchange his sex." There is no question that the white women who cried foul shared the racism of most white males. Thus, the amendment's insult really stung. In their view, ignorant and inferior men would be going to the polls, while women of good breeding and education would not. But more importantly, what stung was the implicit denial that women had played no key role in the Union victory and in Black emancipation. As Americans argued vehemently about the meaning of the Civil War, the memories invoked were decidedly masculine. The story that emerged had no place for women's contribution to the call for abolition or to the winning of the war. How was it possible, the authors of the history asked, that when peace was restored, women received no general recognition for their services, which had been concealed from the people and ignored by the government? The anger at being abandoned by the abolitionists and the disappointment of their expectations of reward wreaked havoc on the women's movement. Where should they turn? Some put aside the demand for broad progressive change that had been evident in the Seneca Falls Declaration and chose instead to focus on the single goal of suffrage. Others, unwilling to sacrifice the broad platform put forward in the Declaration of Sentiments, directed their energies to social reforms like temperance and women's education. Even among the dedicated suffragists, there was no unity. And I just want to add here that despite what many of the leading women political figures today might say, these women did not call themselves suffragettes. In England, they called themselves suffragettes. In America, this was seen as an insult because "et" was a diminutive. So they called themselves suffragists. Even among these women, there was no unity. Stanton and Anthony, who campaigned openly against ratification of the 15th Amendment, soon formed the National Woman Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone asserted her right to lead a movement supporting the amendment by creating the American Woman Suffrage Association. The two organizations disagreed on strategy as well as on leadership. The NWSA, seeing that the hated 19th Amendment had, after all, established the federal government's power to set voting requirements, decided they would focus on winning a similar federal amendment for women. But Stone's AWSA believed that despite the unique 15th Amendment, voting continued to be controlled by state governments. Thus, her organization focused on winning women's suffrage state by state. The rivalry produced terribly poor results. In 1881, only one state, Wyoming, allowed women to vote, and Congress showed absolutely no significant interest in a federal amendment. This was the situation as the authors of the history began their grand project of creating a shared origin memory. And by 1890, the success of this origin myth was secure. In that year, the two suffrage organizations merged, and a revived state-by-state strategy slowly began to show results. Before the century's end, 3 more states, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, had passed votes for women. In 1900, Carrie Chapman, Catt, a member of the next generation, took over the now united NAWSA and increased the state-by-state push for women's suffrage. Between 1900 and 1913, 7 more Western states, Washington, California, Oregon, Arizona, Kansas was then considered a Western state, Alaska, and Illinois gave the vote to women. Or at least we should say women won the vote there. In 1916, however, a new split on the movement emerged. A young, charismatic Quaker named Alice Paul, impatient with the progress of suffrage, split from the NAWSA and created an organization of her own, the National Woman's Party. Paul, who was born in 1885, after the 3 volumes had appeared, was a member of that very younger generation to whom the history's origin myth had been addressed. She revived Stanton's strategy of seeking a federal amendment, but she embraced tactics that would have shocked her idol. Under Paul's leadership, the young women of the NWP staged parades, picketed the White House, chained themselves to its gates, and when they were arrested and jailed, staged hunger strikes. Despite forced feeding by the prison guards, the women persisted. I want to add, because we have a tendency to talk as if American exceptionalism was an extremely real thing. All of Paul's techniques, all of her strategies, the parades, the picketing of the White House, the chaining of themselves to its gates, actually came from the years she spent in England working with the suffragettes. This time, however, the split in the movement proved to be a real advantage. While Paul's tactics galvanized popular support, Catt's steady and well-placed application of political pressure on Congress and on President Wilson in particular ultimately led to the 19th Amendment. The ratification battle provided only one memorable moment, as most states simply agreed to ratify. As the deciding vote in the Tennessee legislature came, its youngest member, Harry Byrne, received a telegram from his mother. She urged him to be, quote, a good boy and vote yes. And like the good boy that he was, Harry did indeed. On August 18th, 1920, the amendment that was popularly known as the Anthony Amendment became law. But let me return to this origins myth, for as a historian, I feel compelled to set the record straight. First, the authors of the history knew very well that the call for women's equality did not begin at Seneca Falls in 1848. They knew that in the previous century, women like Mary Wollstonecraft of England, America's Judith Sargent Murray and Susanna Rowson, and others had asserted the intellectual and moral equality of women and had called for social and legal reforms. Wollstonecraft, an English philosopher, had published a path-breaking book, A Vindication to the Rights of Women in 1792, that was widely read in the new United States. Her demand was simple and clear. She wrote, I do not wish women to have power over men, she wrote, but over themselves. And in America, the revolution had spurred a number of women and even a few men to argue that women's participation in the struggle for liberty had put the lie to older operating beliefs of female intellectual and moral inferiority. If, as it had so long been claimed, women were frivolous and ignorant, as Judith Sargent Murray declared, this was because they had been denied education and any civic purpose. Murray rejected the idea that moral judgment was a male monopoly. As she put it, there is no sex in soul. Later in the decades before Seneca Falls, Angelina Grimke and Sarah Grimke, those two Southern women, daughters of plantation owner, who came north and became leading spokespeople for the abolitionist movement, wrote and spoke out publicly about the natural right of women to full participation in their society. Coming out of the abolition movement, these women recognized the parallels between legal deprivations of liberty based on race and those placed on gender. In Sarah Grimke's powerful 1838 essays, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Conditions of Women, this South Carolina woman declared, all I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on that ground which God designed us to occupy. Her younger sister, Angelina, concurred. I recognize no rights but human rights, she wrote. I know nothing of men's rights and women's rights. Stanton, Anthony, and Gage could not really ignore these women philosophers and activists. They knew that the roots of the women's movement had been laid down long before Seneca Falls. In their own lifetimes, the authors had seen evidence of it in the Black women who resisted slavery, in the Lowell Mill Girls' strike for fair treatment and higher wages, and in the petition for women's suffrage sent by 6 women to the New York State Constitutional Convention a full 2 years before the meeting at Seneca Falls. And they also knew that there had been a suffrage victory in the past. The women of New Jersey had been granted the vote by their state constitutions in 1776, and they had exercised that right until it was taken away in the revised Constitution of 1807. If you can get to Philadelphia, I really urge you to go to the Museum of the American Revolution, where they have put on a spectacular and documented exhibit on New Jersey women's voting rights. But if these authors of the history could not ignore this evidence, they could pigeonhole it. In their determination to make Seneca Falls the origin of the movement for women's rights, they simply labeled all these predecessors antecedent women and their achievements as a kind of prehistory of the women's movement that had been brought into existence at Seneca Falls. Now, this sleight of hand was not the only flaw in their origin myth. The myth begins, after all, with an account of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's outrage that she and Lucretia Mott were denied delegate seats at the World Anti-Slavery Conference in London in 1840. But in fact, Stanton was not a delegate to that convention. She attended as the wife of her abolitionist husband. Mott, who was a veteran leader of the abolitionist movement and a real delegate, was much less irate. She was apparently accustomed to slights like this. In fact, Mott's own diary does not corroborate Stanton's claim that then and there the two women vowed to work together on a women's convention. What did bring about the 1848 convention? That year, Mott paid a social visit to upstate New York to visit relatives and friends. Her host decided to invite a few women, including Stanton, who lived nearby, over for tea. Conversation turned to the injustices suffered by women, and the group decided to put a notice in the local newspapers that announced, quote, a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition of woman. They then drafted the Declaration of Sentiments. To their amazement, some 300 people showed up for the July 19th convention. The meeting was chaired by Lucretia Mott's husband, James, because proper matrons were well aware that it would be scandalous for a woman to wield the gavel. All the resolutions covering the issues raised by the Declaration passed unanimously, except for the 9th, which called for suffrage. It was only when Frederick Douglass rose to give his support to women's vote that this resolution passed. But where was Susan B. Anthony, who by 1890 was lauded as the mother of suffrage? She was not at Seneca Falls. More conventions followed, and many were far more radical than Seneca Falls. In Rochester, for example, a woman chaired the meeting. By 1851, the movement had spread as far as Ohio and Indiana, and activists had decided to hold the first national women's convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was there in 1851 that Anthony first met Stanton. In the 1850s, few women's rights activists thought of Seneca Falls as the birthplace of women's rights. In truth, few of them cared where or when it had begun, but Stanton did. That convention gave Elizabeth Cady Stanton her mission in life, and she never stopped to wonder if it had had the same magical impact on other women. Decades later, when Stanton was eclipsed and Carrie, Chapman, Catt, and her generation referred to Anthony as their Saint Susan, it was generally claimed that Anthony had been the founding figure at Seneca Falls, another myth. But after her death, a descendant of Stanton's challenged Saint Susan's role as midwife to the movement. He wrote, "Miss Anthony had no more to do with the convention of 1848 than did the man in the moon." And he was correct. Yet the origin myth persisted, and the monument erected at Seneca Falls became its symbol. Recently, however, activists and scholars have begun a revision of this history of women's rights. To these critics, the characters on the myth stage are all too white. Their agenda ignored the rights and roles of women of color. Their middle-class sensibility diverted attention away from more radical goals. The emphasis on the vote, these modern historians now argued, moved concerns important to working women, to the poor, and to Black women to the corners of the stage. A new, more inclusive origin story definitely is needed. One that embraces Sojourner Truth, Frances E.W. Harper, the labor heroines like Jessie Lopez de la Cruz, Mary Leash, and Rose Snyderman. Or perhaps instead of one origin story, the women's movement needs many. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. That was a wonderful presentation. I think we're going to look in the chat to see if people have questions. They can ask in the chat. I see there's a question. Where's the exhibit on New Jersey women's rights Carol mentioned?
It's in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And it is really an extraordinary story. Historians of the Revolutionary era knew that for a brief period of time, New Jersey women, and by the way, free Blacks in New Jersey had the vote. But since we didn't have any evidence of who voted or how many women voted, we really didn't pay a lot of attention to that. Historians like to have documents in their hand. They like to be able to say, see, we can tell you X number of people voted. Some people even wrote about it as a kind of joke. Oh yeah, isn't that cute? In New Jersey, there may have been some women who voted. The researchers at the museum, I was on the scholarly committee to advise them on the whole exhibit. And we said, Rosemary Zagaro and Laurel Ulrich and I said, you know, you'd have to find polling records, and I'm sure you won't be able to find them. Never say that. Because in fact, the researchers at the museum found polling records. They found a number of them with women's names on them. New Jersey women who did vote. And they researched these women. Some of them were very difficult to find anything about them because they were sort of ordinary women. But they went to church records and they found some information about these women. And you can see all of this in this exhibit. Now, the exhibit is broader than just having found this evidence. Because one of the points they're trying to make, which is part of what I was trying to do in my talk, was that the struggle for women's equality is far older than Seneca Falls. And the legacy of the American Revolution and the legacy of these New Jersey women voters has to be taken into account. And the irony of this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony knew about this because they actually went to live in New Jersey when they were older. And they made reference to, when they tried to vote before the amendment was ever passed, Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't live to see the amendment passed, but they said, we are going to vote just like our predecessors did in 1776 in New Jersey. So they knew about this, but you don't see it as part of the flow of women's struggle for equality in their 3-volume history of the suffrage. So I urge you, I haven't been there to see the exhibit because of COVID, but that's the first stop on my, for me, when this horrible thing is ended.
Carol, here's another question from the chat. It seems that the History of Suffrage book probably brought the movement into the mainstream for a lot of women who may not have been aware of how widespread was the movement, and may have encouraged them to join and change their personal attitudes towards suffrage. So perhaps it may have had a positive impact. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It did have a positive. I do not in any way, shape, or form think that origin myths don't have an impact. Pat may know, because she's may have heard my talk on the Constitutional Convention. And I say this also has an origin myth about this group of supposedly all brilliant men who knew just what they were doing and who were confident about what they were doing. Origin myths are terribly important, and there's not a country in the world that doesn't have them. And this 3-volume work on suffrage definitely was a success, in the sense that Carrie Chapman Catt and other women and Alice Paul of that next generation saw the convention at Seneca Falls and the things it stood for as what they wanted to identify with. So absolutely, it was extremely important to that next generation. It's just
Another question, Carol, is did Afro-American women gain the vote at the time of the 19th Amendment, or did they gain it later, as I've heard said? Do you know the answer to that?
White was not mentioned in the women's suffrage amendment. That is designating only white women. But the vast majority of African-American women at the time lived in the Jim Crow South. And not only did they not vote, but the men did not vote either by the 20th century, when the Republican Party had abandoned Black men and Reconstruction had long, 2 decades earlier, ended, and segregation and white power had taken over in the South. So technically, Black women gained the vote, but in real terms, it really was not until the Civil Rights Movement that Black women earned the vote. And we should all, or many of us who wanted to see Joe Biden become president, are very happy that they got the vote when they did. So legally, they had the vote, but practically they did not.
Carol, another question. This is from Connie Kehoe. It's my understanding that in New York State, women's suffrage came in 1917. Do you have any information about the leaders of that effort here in New York?
No, I really don't. I always like to admit I could make something up, but I don't really know. This is not something I studied, but I had a graduate student, and I'm now having a senior moment. I can picture her clearly, but she has just put out a book on suffrage in New York. And if you go on Amazon.com and say women's suffrage in New York, you'll find her book, and I'll remember her name in a few minutes. And she knows knows everything about the development of that experience. I do not.
Okay. Carol, I actually have a question for you.
Okay.
You know, obviously the history of the both women's movement and women's efforts to support their rights is long, as you've pointed out. I'm just, how does it resonate today? We now have a new vice president vice president elect,
Right.
who's a woman, first time in our country. How do you tie that together with the
And a
issues that
Black
you've
woman.
talked
I
about?
mean,
A Black woman, yes, and an Indian American woman as well.
yes. I'm sort of a materialist, not an intellectual historian, really. And I've been thinking about this. How did this come about? And I think we have to look at structural changes after World War II. That is, we have to look at the fact that all those women who went to work in factories were driven out of factories, but they didn't stop working. That is, they did not exit the workplace. Bill Chafe, who Pat and I went to graduate school with, has written about this extensively. They went into working in department stores, being secretaries, being stenographers, so that they continued to earn independent money. When Abigail Adams wrote to her husband and said, "Remember the ladies," a lot of people think she was saying, "Let us vote." She wanted married women's property laws reformed. She wanted the fact that until actually 1848 in New York, when the first married women's property laws were passed, everything a woman owned, from the clothes on her back to her body, belonged to her husband. She had no economic independence. And so if you see by 1950, that there are women who are earning money and have a degree of independence, that I think is critical to the emergence of Kamala Harris. You also see that this explosion of consumerism among the middle class led to many middle class suburban white families in which they couldn't get all the refrigerators and freezers and vacuum cleaners that they wanted unless both the husband and the wife worked. And then you had this extraordinary entrance of married women into the workforce as well. And one of the things that results from many things result from women's economic independence. Divorce rates emerge and develop because you're not dependent on your husband. And women's civic and women's political role begins to, the fact that it is not commensurate with their economic role begins to even out. And I think that leads ultimately to more women being involved in politics. After all, they have a stake in what laws are passed. Income tax laws affect them as well as men. And so you begin to see a greater connection in their minds to their own lives, politics to their own lives. And I think that this leads invariably, or maybe I don't want to say inevitably, but it leads to women's organizations in politics, and it leads, I think, ultimately to women being a force in politics. Of course, changed ideology also, I mean, the 60s and now my daughter's generation, who take for granted that women are equal to men in every way. That is, the gender ideology shift is important, but I think we should trace it back to the economic roots of women's independence.
Carol, in the chat, Sarah Cox has suggested, could the book you're trying to remember be Women Will Vote, Winning Suffrage in New York by Susan Goodyear? Is that your?
No, that is one, but that's not the one that I'm thinking of. I really apologize. I
That's okay. You'll think of it and we'll send it around everybody as well.
I need to have sticky notes that remind me of. By the way, the wonderful book from which much of this talk was taken is The Myth of Seneca Falls by Lisa Tetrault. It's beautifully written and it's honest to goodness. Such a great revision of the majestic story of Seneca Falls that I really urge you to take a look at that. But Susan's book is a good start on New York suffrage.
So do we have any more questions? If anybody has in the chat, yes, here's the one. Thanks. How do you feel about the 3 women's monument recently erected in New York City?
You know,
Sojourner Youth, Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Lady Stanton.
Though I am sequestered most of the time, I take 2 long walks in Central Park every day. Otherwise, I'd go crazy. And I walk past that statue regularly. And I was tempted to take a photograph of it and send it to you, Chet, and say, just, add this to the slide presentation. It was very controversial. Women disagreed, women's historians disagreed, the web was flooded with arguments about who should be in it and who shouldn't be in it. Certainly an African-American woman, though I'm not sure it should have been Sojourner Truth, it could very well have been Frances Harper instead, but she is not a household name, whereas probably school kids have studied who Sojourner Truth was. I think Alice Paul, there could have been a bigger group of women in that statue. Alice Paul, I think, was a critically important Carrie Chapman Catt, but it's symbolic. And in amongst the 8,000 statues to second-rate poets from England that fill that park, and generals and people with swords in their hand, it's nice just to have a statue to women. There are now, every borough in New York, as you probably know, it is slated to have statues commemorating women. And the one in Brooklyn to Shirley Chisholm is just spectacular. So I'm just happy to see a statue for women. And I want there to be many, many more in Central Park. We can do without some of those men who nobody's ever heard of. We can put some, there's a statue in Central Park to a dog, right? Let's have more statues to women. It's a very well done piece of sculpture, but it doesn't encapsulate all the range of figures. Where's Rose Snyderman? There are other people to laud that are missing, but baby steps, small steps. This is a good start.
Another question's come in. Do you know how much influence the Black sorority movement, let's see, Black sorority movement had on encouraging Black women towards social activism? I mention this because Kamala is so supportive.
Yes, Kamala Harris at Howard. I would probably, 3 cheers for that sorority, and I'm very happy. But I would argue that the small Black women's colleges all through the South probably had more impact. Howard is like the Harvard of Black schools, and there are scores of smaller Black women's colleges all throughout the South that I think probably, don't forget, there was a Black women's movement in the early 20th century for uplift. It was called the Black Uplift Movement, and it was led by women, Black middle-class women in the South, long before that sorority got formed. And so, though I think it's important, I would put more weight on Black Southern colleges than I would on Howard and that sorority.
Another comment and question came in, Carol. Perhaps a very strong argument for women's suffrage is the fact that women are responsible for most of the really hard work to make our political system work. I'm not sure that's a question or more of a statement and an assertion, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, it's also true that women's work in domestic production is responsible for farms in America surviving all throughout the colonial period. And I mean, women's work has always been either ignored or undervalued because for a long time it wasn't paid labor. And so, of course, it's also true that in organizations, I'll give you a real good example. Deborah Gardner has an article called I think the 3% solution. It's not about Freud and drugs. It's about the progressive movement, that women did all the legwork for the reform of housing, the rise of the tenement buildings that had air for everyone. What are they called? They have dumbbell tenement buildings so that fresh air could get to all the people living in those buildings. All the work done on that, all the legwork, all the research was done by women. And when the report came out, it only listed the male heads of the Reform Society. So it's ever been that way. It really has always been that way. So it shouldn't be surprising that in political work, it's also that way. In the abolitionist movement, women had abolitionist fairs. They raised all the money so that people like Theodore Weld could go around the country giving speeches and become the most famous abolitionist who ever walked the earth. And it was all done. All the publications were financed by women holding these abolitionist fairs where they sold pies and handmade potholders and other things like that. So this is fairly common throughout American history. So it's not surprising that it's also true in politics. Although these days, Stacey Abrams is certainly not hiding her light under a bushel. I mean, these days, women, and Emily's List, these days, women's organizations are sort of front and center. And I always like to think that anonymous husbands are doing the knitting and the crocheting in the background, though it's not true. So I think that that's changing a lot. I think more women have run for local and state office in the last 2 election cycles than ever in the history of elective politics. So I think things have substantially changed.
Carol, we have one more question. Let's have this be our final question, but it's a good one. Your role as a woman in women's history is very important. When did this study first begin to be recognized of women's history? And did it begin at universities or elsewhere?
When I went to graduate school back in the Stone Age, in the late 1960s, I asked my advisor, a lovely, wonderful man and a great historian, can I write something about colonial women? And he said, "Oh, what a lovely idea, Carol, but there are no sources and there's nothing really to say." To his credit, 10 years later, he said to me, "I was wrong and you were right." But none of the women who were the so-called founders of women's history wrote their dissertations on women. They wrote their dissertations on men. That was what you did. But the protests of the 60s and 70s and the participation of us in those protest movements, but also the fact that graduate school opened up in the 1960s to people who had never been there before. Women, African Americans, working class boys, ethnic boys. They opened up because so many new colleges had been created and they didn't have faculty for them. And when we all got to graduate school, at some point or another, all of us thought, gee, you know, I wonder what women were doing in the past. I wonder what the working class was doing in the past. I wonder what Italians were doing in the past. And as we, I have to say, as we got tenure, that is job security, we decided to take the plunge. What had been created by all these groups was something called social history or history from the bottom up. And we decided to write that history. And, and in 1980, two path-breaking books in colonial women's history came out, one by Linda Kerber and one by Mary Beth Norton. And books in 19th century history had already begun to come out. And we sort of established this field called women's history. It was very exciting. I mean, it was exciting to be there at the beginning, I guess you can say. And by the end of the 20th century, there were women's studies departments and women's history majors. And there were, you see all those books behind me? Those and many, many more other bookshelves are all books by women about women's, and by men about women's history. And so the field is now so well established that already the things we wrote in the early period are, of course, being revised. Everything, as Linda Kerber once said, she said, first were the pioneers, then were the grand old dames, then we're revised and we're the footnote. And, you know, that's how it ought to be. There's been a lot of new history, a lot of gender theory history that we did not have available to us, new sources. And so I would say that the expansion of graduate student population, the 60s and 70s radical movements or protest movements created the platform that made social history possible. So there are books in African-American history, there are books in working class history, now there are books in gay and lesbian history. The stage on which American history takes place has been greatly, greatly expanded. And, you know, I'm pleased that I played a little part in that. I'll have that written on my tombstone. Thomas Jefferson did. I'll played a part in women's history, have two wonderful children, and go Yankees. Those will be the on my tombstone.
Great, thanks, Carol. Veronica, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just a few. Thank you, Dr. Berkin, for a wonderful presentation and for your great responses to our attendees' thoughts and questions.